We begin this week with a clip from the 2009 congressional hearings on concussions in the NFL.
Commissioner Goodell, is there a link between playing professional football and the likelihood of contracting a brain-related injury such as dementia, Alzheimer's, depression, or CTE?
You're obviously seeing a lot of data and a lot of information that our committees and others have presented with respect to the linkage. And the medical experts should be the one to be able to continue that debate. But our bottom line is we're not waiting for that debate to continue.
California Representative Linda Sanchez.
The NFL sort of has this kind of blanket denial or minimizing of the fact that there may be this, link. And it sort of reminds me of the tobacco companies pre-90s when they kept saying, no, there's no link between smoking and damage to your health or ill health effects.
So apart from her comparing the NFL to big tobacco, a lot of the hearings sounded much the same. The congressional committee keeps trying to get Goodell to admit there's a link between Alzheimer's, depression, CTE, and hits to the head. And Goodell keeps deferring to the researchers who at the time were just on the tip of the iceberg of their findings, funded in good part by the league itself. Goodell continually states that he's not waiting for the conclusions and he's proactively trying to make his game safer. And over the next few years, it seems like he backs it up. He unleashes a flurry of rules designed seemingly with player safety in mind. The reaction from fans and the media isn't exactly sympathetic.
You lower your head and you plow through. They're going to make that a penalty now if this actually comes to pass. It would be the first rule.
Listen, Roger Goodell, these are grown men, and they make their decision to play in the NFL. They know they're going to get run over. They know they're going to get crushed. So why are you making these dumb rule changes to make the game wimpier in the first place?
Some fans even wrote songs calling for his resignation.
And then I lost it. Hey, Roger Goodell, you can go to hell because you ruined the sport. This ain't no basketball court. This is a football field.
A part of this is the hyperbole that saturates NFL coverage. Every blown call, every new rule, every GM thinking about signing Tim Tebow is put under a desperate microscope, fueling our appetite for the king of American sports. But another part of it is our love of a good scandal. When you find out the Patriots are videotaping other teams' practices, or Greg Williams is running a bounty pool, there's a thrilling discomfort that comes with the conversation that follows. It urges you to tune in next week, click the next link, or in 1906, buy that next paper. This week we bring you a story of dream teams, fixed games, and a presidential threat to ban the sport completely. For the National Football Post, along with the Professional Football Researchers Association, welcome to Throwbacks.
Johnson was a preaching to his flock at a big camp meeting one day. At a big camp meeting one day.
In 1906, the fierce rivalry between the Canton and Massillon pro football teams took a turn toward the unsavory. Most of the nastiness came from fans goaded by newspaper hyperbole. Incendiary phrases like hated foe and bitter enemy lit up sports pages and ignited fiery oaths on street corners. But managers George Williams of Canton and J.J. Wise of Massillon conducted their clubs with the ethics typical of American businesses at the time. There might be surprise signings of stars and the occasional tricky contract negotiation, but ultimately there were real limits as to how far either side might go to humble and humiliate the other. It was all right to hit below the belt, but no brass knuckles, please.
You can't preach and rob me too.
But before the 1906 season ended, all restraints disappeared. Each side stood accused by the other of unfair and illegal practices. There were charges of darker, more dastardly deeds by individuals on both sides. Each club swore never to play the other again, and each was likely to follow through on that threat because both were out of the football business. For Ohio professional football in general, and for Massillon and Canton in particular, 1906 was a season of unprecedented disaster. To many Canton minds, the first shot fired in all-out war came a few days after the Massillon Tigers defeated the Canton team for the 1905 state championship. A news story in the Cleveland Plain Dealer alleged Canton was broke and couldn't pay its players for the final game. Manager Williams indignantly denied that, insisting every dollar promised had indeed been delivered. Although the story appeared in Cleveland, many Cantonians believed it originated in Massillon as a trick to discredit the Canton Athletic Club and make it difficult to recruit better players in 1906. Such Machiavellian tactics weren't ascribed to J.J. Wise, who even in Canton was considered an honorable man. But Coach Ed J. Stewart was regarded by his foes as about as untrustworthy as they came. With his newspaper connections, Cantonians reasoned Stewart could have easily planted the story. Whether or not Stewart was responsible for the plain dealer's story, it didn't take a genius to figure out the Canton Athletic Club couldn't actually have paid its 1905 debts from the often meager game receipts. Fortunately, Canton had many civic-minded businessmen willing to shoulder the losses just to get another shot at Massillon. Cantonites insisted the Massillon Tigers were deep in the red, too, but J.J. Wise released a statement showing $16,037 in receipts and only $16,015 in expenditures. He said he pocketed the $22.25 profit for his efforts as manager. The only problem with Wise's figures was that he listed salaries, including railroad fare, at $6,740, which means the players were getting about $50 per game. That might have been the going rate for some, but some of the better players on the team must have been paid bonuses by Massillon Angels. No matter what 1905 had cost, it wasn't so much that either side was ready to throw in the towel. Both planned to go whole hog in 1906. But for a while, it looked like there might not be a 1906 season.
Then ring the undertaker up and make him bring a hearse. Have all the surgeons ready, therefore they'll have work today. Oh, can't you see the football team are lining up to play? Football.
The problem was that football players kept getting injured and sometimes killed. Newspapers showed a running count through 1905, and the final totals listed 18 deaths and 149 serious injuries across the country. Those figures wouldn't have amounted to much for some factories or many mines, but they were shocking for a sport. The Chicago Tribune had the tally of the dead and injured in 1905.
Of those slaughtered, 11 were high school players, and 10 of the killed were immature boys of 17 and under. 3 hardened, seasoned, and presumably physically fit college men were slain. The others were amateurs. Body blows producing internal injuries were responsible for 4 deaths. Concussion of the brain claimed 6 victims. Injuries to the spine resulted fatally in 3 cases. Blood poisoning carried off 2 gridiron warriors. And other injuries caused 4 deaths. Among the injuries that have not resulted fatally are broken collarbones and shoulders, 19. Broken legs, 31. Broken arms, 9. Fractures to some portion of the head, 19. Broken ribs, 3. Spinal injuries, 3. Concussion of the brain, 3.
Football was branded as brutal, and people wanted it outlawed. A photo of Bob Tiny Maxwell brought things to a boil. Maxwell was a 250-pound guard and by far the most compelling force on the Swarthmore College team when they took on the University of Pennsylvania. Penn reasoned that by stopping Maxwell, it would stop Swarthmore, and to that end they concentrated their attack on this talented but dreadfully outnumbered man. By his own determination and perhaps miraculous intervention, Maxwell survived. But when he staggered off the field at the end of the game, a photographer with an eye for the grotesque snapped his picture, and when President Roosevelt saw it, he gasped in horror. Roosevelt is quoted as saying, "Brutality and foul play should receive the same summary punishment given a man who cheats at cards." He announced that football should clean up its act or be banned by presidential edict.
But they will never put that hunchback shoulders to the ground. Football.
Columbia University stole a march on the president and dropped football, and stayed dropped until 1915. Other schools began lining up to do the same. A tide of revulsion swept the country. In January, after much wringing of hands and several false starts, a meeting was held of what eventually came to be the National Collegiate Athletic Association's Football Rules Committee. With the intention of eliminating or at least reducing the brutality in the game, they rewrote the rulebook just enough to placate most of the critics, and almost incidentally, they changed the game completely and forever. In the long view, the most revolutionary rule change was the brainchild of John Heisman, best known now for the trophy that bears his name, but best known then as the successful and innovative coach at Georgia Tech. He proposed legalizing the forward pass, until then a maneuver contemplated by only the less than legal. Heisman correctly deduced that the pass could open up the game, but Walter Camp, college football's leading guru at the time, opposed throwing the ball. Sir Walter usually got his way, but in this case the rulemakers were willing to clutch just about any straw. From that day on, the tossing forward of the pigskin was to be allowed. Legal or not, the forward pass was no panacea. There were so many restrictions on passing at first that it only had slight impact on play. Few teams even used it. Those coaches who were willing to experiment argued over the best way to hurl the ball. Some actually preferred end over end. Of more immediate effect in reducing the game's gore were 3 other moves made by the Rules Committee. First, they clarified the rule that stated that at least 6 men, later 7, had to be on the line of scrimmage, thus reducing mass plays. Second, they installed a neutral zone the width of the football between the 2 opposing lines. This cut down considerably on dirty play. And third, in an effort to force teams to open up their offenses and abandon the grinding tactics that were dangerous to anyone who got in the way and boring to anyone watching, they increased the yardage a team had to go for a first down from 5 yards in 3 tries to 10 yards in 3 attempts. What this last move actually did was return the emphasis to kicking by making punting and field goals more common. In 1912, rulemakers gave teams an extra down to make 10, and so it has remained. The rule changes of 1906 didn't save football, as it's often claimed. As a matter of fact, the number of football-related deaths actually increased in 1906. But the changes assured the public that the football hierarchy was aware of the problem and willing to make changes. The game was given a reprieve, and eventually the necessary changes were accomplished. Cantonites were still mad about that Cleveland newspaper story asserting Canton Athletic Club's insolvency when they got a second bit of disturbing news from Massillon. Ed Stewart replaced Jacob Wise as Tiger team manager. Wise had other worries to take care of, and Stewart, after coaching 3 straight state championships, was certainly his logical successor. But in a suspicious Canton, Ed Stewart's promotion was regarded with many jaundiced eyes. To replace Stewart as coach, Massillon imported young Sherburne Whiteman from Swarthmore, and before that Chicago University. As a graduate of Amos Alonzo Stagg's system of football, Whiteman was expected to upgrade the Tigers by imparting intricacies learned at the knee of the master. Whiteman would need all the help he could get. Almost immediately he learned the Tigers faced 1906 without 4 of the big guns who'd helped them win in 1905. And worse yet, the 4 former Tigers would line up in the red and white of Canton. Canton coach Blondy Wallace, using the time-honored method of offering more money, convinced quarterback Jack Hayden, tackle Jack Lang, guard Herman Kirchhoff, and end Clark Schrantz that they'd be happier in Canton. Schrantz had been the Tigers' field captain. Hayden and Lang were solid pros, and Kirchhoff was widely regarded as the world's greatest lineman. Replacing any one of them would have been difficult. Replacing all 4 looked impossible. Many Stark County football fans believed Wallace had bought himself a championship. Although the name Bulldogs is among the most honored in football history, no one's quite sure how it came to be affixed to the Canton team. They weren't called that in 1905, nor through most of the 1906 season. As late as November 4th, editorial cartoonist R.C. Johnson of the Canton Repository was able to picture the Canton team only as a man with a club lying in wait for the Massillon Tiger. Most references to the team called it Canton Athletic Club, or CAC, or the Canton 11. Occasional variants were the Red and White, or Wallace's Men. Suddenly, almost overnight, they became the Bulldogs. Whatever the source, the image of the bulldog began appearing in editorial cartoons in both the Repository and the Morning News. For a month, the name was on all lips. Then events transpired that brought the name into such disrepute that it wouldn't resurface for a decade. The Canton season, to all important intents and purposes, didn't begin until they had their new nickname. True, they played 8 times between October 7th and November 4th, but those were nothing more than warm-ups for the big games scheduled at the end of the season. Kirchhoff and Hayden didn't even join the team until the 8 preliminaries were out of the way. Canton had more than enough firepower to cruise through. Joining Clark Schronce at end was 210-pound Tom Thorpe from Columbia, who one day became famous as an official. Wallace, Lang, and Jack Ernst shared the tackle positions. A 255-pound giant named Van Raalb, playing under the pseudonym Riley, came from New York to star at guard. Former halfback Ed Murphy, a solid 213 pounds, kept the other guard position warm until Kirchhoff arrived. The center was possibly the only man in the world who could play the position on par with Massillon's Big Bob Schring. Although he gave away 70 pounds to the Tiger star, Lynn Pop Sweet's reputation as snapper supreme equaled that of his larger rival. Behind this fearsome line ranged several speedy halfbacks. The best known of the crew was veteran pro Twister Steinberg, so named for his elusive running style. Dave Cure, who scored 135 points in 1905, lined up at fullback. Vince Stevenson, All-American from Penn, was signed to quarterback the crew, but he was hurt in the third game. Steinberg ran the team from then until Hayden arrived. The squad opened with an easy 57-0 win over Fredericksburg, a team guided by Doc Merriam, who'd played end for Massillon in 05. The most significant aspect of the game was they played it on a Sunday, a somewhat revolutionary idea in 1906 Canton. The football management hoped that by playing on Sunday, when no colleges or high schools would be similarly engaged, they might increase their crowds enough to cover some of the salaries of their talented players. None of the games are even close. Canton breezes through opponent after opponent. 14-0 at Moundsville, 31-0 at Toledo, 49-0 over Benwood. The closest anyone got was an 8-0 game against the Pittsburgh Lyceum. Attendance for the Canton home games was low. Only 800 showed for the Pittsburgh game. A 57-0 slaughter of the Broadway Athletic Club of Cleveland drew the smallest crowd yet to Mahaffey Park. After 8 games, the Canton 11 was undefeated, untied, untested, and unappreciated. Only record crowds for the final games could keep the red and white from ending deep in the hole. A widespread rumor held that the players actually had drawn very little in salaries, the money being withheld to be bet for them on the Massillon games. Massillon, the strength of the Tigers was in the center of the line. Local boy Fred Haig was still making good with his 255 pounds at guard, and Big Bob Schring held center in place at only a few pounds less. To replace the departed Kirchhoff at the other guard, Whiteman imported an old friend, Bob Tiny Maxwell, the Swarthmore giant whose photo had outraged President Roosevelt. Whiteman and Maxwell had been teammates at Chicago U in 1903 and had gone off to Swarthmore together. Indeed, some cynical souls suggested that young Sherburne's primary coaching credentials consisted of his friendship with the Tiny One, the inference being that Massillon took Whiteman as a route to Maxwell. The prospect of the eighth of a ton Maxwell meeting the equally large Kirchhoff on the grid of honor had Stark County fans slathering in anticipation. E.P. King of Purdue and Ted Nesser, the Columbus strongman, made a competent pair of tackles. There was less than perfection at the ends where Clark Schronce was missed. Bullet Riley could bring speed, if not much, to the wing position. Several adequate backs were available to lug the ball. The big news was the signing of quarterback George Peggy Parrott, the same man who caused such a stir in Ohio grid circles the year before when, as a senior at Case, he was accused, then admitted to playing pro football. He was regarded as an excellent replacement for the Canton-bound Hayden. Despite an undeniable degree of talent, the Tigers appeared slightly less impressive on paper than the hated Cantonites. But football games aren't won on paper, and it quickly became evident that Sherburne Whiteman ran a far tighter ship than Blondy Wallace. Using more cohesive team play, the Tigers began knocking off the same kind of opposition faced by Canton, and by greater scores. On September 29th, a week before Canton took the field, Massillon treated the Pittsburgh Lyceum to a 19-0 beating. A week later, they embarrassed Muskingum College 96-0. And the next Saturday, they took a happy jaunt over to Wheeling, West Virginia, where they beat the Benwood Athletic Club 46-0. Although the performances to that point bordered on flawless, a few nitpickers insisted they'd seen some tiny imperfections at the ends. This, however, was remedied when the Tigers met the Shelby Athletic Club on October 20th. Walter East was installed at wing. He'd been known for his baseball endeavors. He was, in fact, the playing manager of Akron's minor league team. Against Shelby, he showed himself to be quite at home on a gridiron, and his play was publicly commended. For fun, Ted Nesser was allowed to slip out to the other wing so he might engage the attention of his older brother John, who lined up at end for the Shelbys. The most talked about event of the day occurred when Maxwell gained possession of the ball and ran 65 yards for a touchdown. With laughable ease, the Tigers downed the club widely regarded as the third best in Ohio by a 57-0 score. On Thursday, October 27th, as the Tigers thumped a combined Benwood-Moundsville squad at Massillon by 61-0, Peggy Parrott returned a kickoff 100 yards for a touchdown and walked 65 yards to another, when everyone but Parrott and the referee thought a play had been blown dead. Of historical interest, news accounts mentioned that Parrott completed one of those newfangled forward passes to Bullet Riley. Peggy'd been practicing throwing during the preceding summer, and it's likely he'd already tried out the new weapon in an earlier tilt. Nevertheless, this one's the earliest authenticated example of a pro-completed forward pass. Unfortunately for the stuff of legends, the toss only gained a few yards and played no part in the game's outcome. 2 days later, in one of the few tight games played by Canton, Townsend threw to Schrantz for 7 yards to keep an important drive alive. Regardless of historical precedent, neither of these throws, nor a scattered few late-season throws, gave much indication that the aerial game would ever become anything more than showy curiosity. Massillon ended October in a blinding rain and heavy mud at Toledo with a 49-0 slaughter of the local athletic association. The Tigers geared up by hiring 3/4 of the University of Wisconsin's 1905 backfield to run the ball. On November 3rd, a crowd of 2,200, far more than the Tigers had grown to expect, came to the Asylum grounds to watch them take on the Wilmington, Delaware Orange, billed as one of the top teams in the East. The Tigers waltzed to a 77-0 victory as the second half was shortened by 15 minutes out of boredom. One feature that occasioned interest was that several professional gamblers from Canton were given the privilege of the sideline by the Massillon management. Rumor had it that nearly all the Canton gamblers planned to back Massillon against the Bulldogs, but their speculative loyalty should earn them honored places near the Tiger bench surprised more than one observer. Election Day found the Tigers enjoying a 33-0 picnic at Pittsburgh against the Lyceum. After the game, Massillon fans were surprised to learn that Akron baseballer Walter East had been released. East was playing well, but subsequent signings convinced most observers that Stewart and Whiteman were merely upgrading their squad. A more sinister reason for his departure would be announced later. Meanwhile, all thoughts turned to the upcoming meeting between the Tigers and the Bulldogs. That the two pro-colossi would never meet in 1906 was probably never believed by Stark County fans. Yet for a while, there was a distinct possibility that the rival managements wouldn't be able to come to an agreement. In early September, several weeks before either club began playing, Wallace and Williams met the Massillon Brain Trust at the Lakeside Country Club to start negotiations. According to Canton accounts, their offer was for 2 games, one in Canton in October and one in Massillon in December. Each home club would receive 60% of the gate and the reserved seat rights. Though this appeared an even-Steven tit-for-tat arrangement, Massillon came away screaming. In the first place, Canton's Mahaffey Park had a larger capacity and more reserved seats than Massillon's Asylum grounds. Secondly, a game played under hoped-for ideal weather conditions in late October stood to draw far better than a contest in the ice and snow of December. If each team took 60% of its home game receipts, Massillon would come up short. As 3-time Ohio champions, the Tigers saw no reason to take a smaller slice of the pie than the upstart Cantons. They announced the Tigers would take the second game only if it was played on Thanksgiving, a day where every football fan in Stark County would presumably rush to Massillon no matter what the weather. Both sides stonewalled until October began. Then Wallace moved. On a quick trip to Pennsylvania, he signed Lang and Schrantz both to strengthen his team and weaken Massillon's. More importantly, he signed an agreement with the Latrobe team to play at Canton on Thanksgiving. Latrobe had gone undefeated for 3 years. They were widely regarded as the only pro aggregation on the planet capable of competing successfully with Canton and Massillon. As a matter of fact, the Cantons actually lost at Latrobe in 1905. As much as they'd miss Lang and Trance, the loss of the coveted Thanksgiving date was a greater blow to Massillon. They dearly needed a couple of lucrative meetings with Canton to reduce some of the debts they were running up in player salaries. People like Maxwell and Parrott didn't come cheap. Canton newspapers insisted Massillon was begging for a game at any terms. This was overstating it. Canton needed those games too. Massillon strongly suspected that the announced Canton-Latrobe game was a hoax to force the Tigers to give in to less than equitable terms. They may have known what Canton fans were never told, that Latrobe was having trouble putting a team together for 1906, and they were definitely not the same club from the previous years. The Tigers seriously doubted that any Canton-Latrobe game would ever happen, but indeed, Canton did expect to play Latrobe. The red and white feared that Massillon would, in some underhanded way, spoil their Thanksgiving Day. With both sides expecting some sneaky trick from the other, a contract was finally signed 3 weeks into October. The full text of this strange document appeared in the Canton Morning News on October 22nd. This agreement made the 20th day of October, 1906, by and between C.E. Wallace, Jr. of Canton, Ohio, party of the first part, and the Massillon Athletic Club, otherwise known as the Tiger Football Team,
That Wallace had become sole spokesman for the Canton team wasn't surprising to anyone familiar with his assertive nature.
But it raised some eyebrows that the next section of the contract indicated a bargaining victory for Massillon. That the parties hereto agree that their regularly scheduled football team shall play 2 games of football with each other and shall share equally the gate receipts.
So not only had the Tigers won 50% of the gates, but both games were to be played in November. The Canton home game was slated for Friday, November 16th, and the Massillon home appearance would come on Saturday, November 24th, the weekend before Thanksgiving. Both sides mutually agreed there'd been a general unwritten understanding at the beginning of the season that they'd play each other on Thanksgiving. But now that was impossible because Canton had an existing arrangement with Latrobe. The use of the term arrangement probably indicated that no written contract could be produced by Wallace to prove he really planned to play Latrobe. This no doubt heightened Massillon's fears that they were being snookered. Just what kind of trick they figured Wallace had up his sleeve is hard to say. Most likely, they assumed he'd try to make some sort of capital out of the results of the 2 scheduled games. For example, if the team split and Blondy suddenly offered to play the Tigers at Canton on Thanksgiving, Massillon would be under tremendous pressure to agree, no matter what the deal was. The mutual mistrust found its legal form in the 4th paragraph of the contract.
Now therefore, in order to ensure the carrying out of this agreement and as evidence of good faith, it is hereby agreed that 1/2 of the game receipts from said first game belonging to Massillon shall be deposited with and held by the Canton Savings and Trust Company until after Thanksgiving 1906, when, if the said game shall have been prevented or in any way influenced or requested to cancel by Massillon, then Massillon's half of said gate receipts from said first game shall be paid and delivered to Canton.
In other words, if Massillon did anything to spoil the Canton-Latrobe meeting, they'd lose all the money from their first game at Canton. But that was only the half of it.
And Canton's 1/2 of the gate receipts from said second game shall be deposited with and held by the Merchants National Bank of Massillon, Ohio, until after Thanksgiving Day, when it shall be paid and delivered to Massillon, in case without fault of Massillon, the said game between Canton and Latrobe is not played on said.
So the cheese was binding. If for any reason other than dirty work by Massillon, the Latrobe team failed to appear at Canton on Thanksgiving, the red and white would lose all of its share of the second game's money. The entire fiscal futures of both teams were staked on the Canton-Latrobe game. In another part of the contract, each team agreed to put up $3,000 as a guarantee that they'd appear on November 16th and 24th. That was almost laughable. Both sides desperately needed the receipts from those 2 games and then some. Wallace and Stewart would each put 11 men on the field if they had to recruit from the street. But the truth was, they were recruiting from among the best football players in the country. And while that might increase the chance of victory, the high salaries such stars could command greatly decreased any chance of finishing in the black. Canton likely put the best football talent on the field in 1905, but Massillon won. They did it primarily with smoother teamwork. Blondy Wallace had been outcoached, or at any rate outprepared, by Massillon. That wouldn't happen in 1906, he vowed. For 2 weeks before November 16th, Wallace sequestered his team on the campus of Penn State. There he drilled them. Penn State coach Tom Fennell gave them special instructions in the use of the forward pass. Back in Canton, some fans said that the great Fielding Yost had come down from Michigan to impart a few words of football wisdom. Massillon stayed home, but Coach Sherb Whiteman ran them through their paces with equal diligence. The Massillon version had Amos Alonzo Stagg sneaking in from Chicago to reveal his secrets. The night before the big game, Wallace and his men arrived back in Canton. Hundreds of fans were there to meet them at the Pennsylvania train station. Hundreds more waiting at the hotel. But Wallace hustled his team to their rooms and off to bed so quickly that those in the throng caught only fleeting glimpses of their heroes. Among those watching most closely were Whiteman and the whole Tiger team, straining to spot any unexpected faces in the Bulldog entourage. All Canton glowed with speculations about the Bulldogs' lineup, sure that Wallace would spring a surprise or two. Many claimed Willie Heston had been smuggled into the city, although Wallace had earlier stated the Michigan Star wouldn't be in the game. All night long, the question was, who has Blondy really landed? This is just a quick timeout to thank the organization that made this podcast today possible. The Pro Football Researchers Association has been publishing stories like the one you're hearing today in their newsletter, The Coffin Corner, since 1979. And if you like the history of football, you really need to join them. Membership's only $35 annually. It gets you access to their newsletter as well as a ton of great stuff on their website, including game books, oral history, voting rights for their Hall of Very Good, and one of the most complete collections of football knowledge anywhere on the internet. I belong, and you should too. For more info on membership, contact them at pfra@profootballresearchers.org or visit them on the web at profootballresearchers.org. Now, back to our story. Teams finally lined up at Mahaffey Park the next day under cloudy skies and with a hint of snow in the air. The Bulldogs were almost a disappointment. No Heston, no surprises. Kirchhoff was at guard where he'd been expected. Other newcomers were an end named Gilchrist and two halfbacks who'd played for Canton in 1905, Andy Bull Smith and Marshall Reynolds. Jack Hayden, the little quarterback who'd done so well for Massillon the year before, was in Canton's red and white, but he was only expected to sub for Stevenson. Then Stevenson wrenched his knee again during warm-ups, and Hayden became the starter. Massillon had a new tackle in Otis Lamson of Penn, and Doc McChesney had come over from Pittsburgh to play end again. Homer Davidson, the great kicker from Shelby, had been signed only 2 days before. Though he was unfamiliar with the Tigers' signals, Coach Whiteman paid him a good salary just to sit on the bench in case a field goal was needed. The Canton Repository estimated the Canton payroll at $8,700 and Massillon's at $9,000. The 2 weeks at Penn State, they said, cost Canton $2,300. It was the biggest game yet in Ohio, bigger than the 05 game. As usual, there were rumors of fix in the air. Big games always brought out such rumors. Someone asked Massillon's manager, Ed Stewart, about them.
Reports as to fixed games originate in the statements of irresponsible parties whose ambition it is to see the Tigers lose, regardless of home pride. It would be impossible to fix the coming football game. It would mean that the management was rotten to the core, that the Canton management was hand-in-hand with any such dishonesty, and that the 40 or more players under contract to the two managements must be dishonest and minus all sense of honor. Such suspicion does discredit to an honest sport and is certainly an injustice to those connected with the teams.
Less than 2 weeks later, Stewart's words would be hurled back in his teeth. Nearly 8,000 people made Mahaffey Park bulge at the seams. They saw a nearly faultless Canton football team. Jack Hayden and Marshall Reynolds were the main heroes for the red and white. Little Jack ran the team faultlessly and drop-kicked a 35-yard field goal in the first half to put the Bulldogs out 4-0. Reynolds ran brilliantly, scoring a second-half touchdown on a nifty end sweep. In the opening half, his punting consistently kept the Tigers back on their heels as Wallace had his team kicking on first down most of the time. Big Bill Edwards, Princeton grade of an earlier age, had been brought in from New York to referee. There was never a question who was in charge. At one point, Wallace sent in a 250-pound sub with a water bucket to relay with some Wallace wisdom to the troops. Such communication violated the rules of the day and Edwards' sense of decorum. He grabbed the sub by the neck and threw him 10 yards across the sideline, water bucket, dipper, and all. No pro game had ever received such coverage. The Bell Telephone Company even had men stationed in the grounds observing. As fast as a play was made, it was telegraphed to all the large cities in the country. Near the end of the second half, Tiny Maxwell picked up a Canton fumble and saw a clear field ahead. He ran 55 yards for a touchdown. But that was the Tigers' best offense all day. The game ended 10-5 for the biggest Canton victory ever. Wallace, Hayden, Reynolds, and the rest could have been elected demigods by acclamation. The cheers of ecstatic Bulldog fans rang into the night. Happiest of all were those who demonstrated fiscal loyalty and collected some of the $8,000 to $10,000 in wagers. Sunday night, after a respectable period of celebration, the Bulldogs entrained once more for Penn State. There was still a second game to be played. Ed Stewart promised he could beat Canton with that same team. The Tigers wouldn't add anyone new either. Bell Telephone announced it would once again telegraph a play-by-play account of the second game. The Wheeling Intelligencer revealed that a movement was on foot to form a football league of 10 or 12 clubs in Ohio, West Virginia, Michigan, and Indiana. The plan originated in Toledo and would be taken up in more detail as soon as the present season was over. Suggested team cities were Toledo, Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Massillon, Canton, Shelby, Akron, Lorain, Wheeling, South Bend, and Indianapolis. But before a league could be formed, the Bulldogs and Tigers would have to go. No one believed that Massillon and Canton would continue to pay such exorbitant prices for football stars. The only chance for the backers to get an even break is to win the annual game between the two All-Star 11s, and this means one or the other city loses all the cash it can scrape. It was believed that the benefit of doing away with such dream teams could be shown to Massillon and Canton so that in the future, football teams more evenly balanced would be able to put up games more satisfactory to the public than those which have been so frequent this season. From the Bulldog training camp came word of a new addition. Wallace telegraphed Eddie Wood, a regular end for Latrobe, and asked him to report to Penn State. Wood had been a successful pro for a decade and figured to fit in easily despite having only 2 days' practice with the team. Immediately after the Canton-Massillon game, Wood planned to return to Latrobe. The Canton Morning News commented,
"The signing of Wood would seem to indicate Blondy isn't very apprehensive about the game with Latrobe on Thanksgiving afternoon. When he's willing to confide the signals and style of play to a Latrobe player, it looks as though he isn't very afraid of them."
Meanwhile, Ed Stewart announced that Big Bill Edwards wouldn't be available to referee because he'd be officiating the Yale-Harvard game. Edward Whiting of Cornell, who'd umpired the first game at Canton, would return and bring a referee with him. By Friday night, half a dozen sports writers from Akron and Cleveland were nosing around Canton, picking up features. They had no way to know that the biggest story would break after the game was over. Finally, the day of the game. The Haynes Photo Company of Canoe photographed the asylum grounds in the midst of play. The view shows the 110-yard field lined off with the peculiar lengthwise lines 5 yards apart parallel to the sidelines that, together with the normal yard markings, turned gridirons into huge green checkerboards from 1906 to 1910. The extra lines were used to judge the legality of forward passes, which had to cross the line of scrimmage 5 yards out from where the ball was put in play. At either end of the field, American flags crown each upright of the goalposts. On the Massillon side, the open bleachers overflow except for a small section down near the end zone where a skinned baseball diamond is visible. Across the field, there's no room left in the smaller Canton bleacher section, and the spectators stand 3 deep behind the bench from end zone to end zone. Perched on the outfield wall are hundreds more. Even the streetcars parked outside the wall have fans on the roofs. In the background, brooding over it all, is the state hospital. Before the game even started, a rhubarb developed over the choice of football. Massillon showed up with a Victor ball, one several ounces lighter than the Spalding ball Canton was used to. Wallace protested that Spalding was the norm, but Massillon was adamant. Blondy could either accept the Victor ball or forfeit the game and the $3,000 guarantee. There was really no choice. Once the game began, the reason for Massillon's preference for the Victor became obvious. Ed Stewart had promised to beat Canton with the same team he'd used on November 16th, and technically he kept his word. All the starting lineup had been in Massillon orange and black for the first game, but this time, Peggy Parrott was shifted out to end. Homer Davidson was at quarterback. Homer had learned the signals in the interim, but his primary responsibility was to kick the daylights out of the ball. The combination of the light Victor and Davidson's talented leg was overpowering. No fewer than 6 times punts sailed over the head of the Bulldog safety Jack Hayden. At first, Canton played into Massillon's hands by punting on first down. The strategy had worked well in the first game. Davidson's punting made that idea foolhardy, as the Tigers gained on every exchange. They also gained consistently around the Bulldog ends. That was a shock. Canton expected the Tigers to attack through the middle, and Wallace had ordered his ends to crash in. They were consistently outflanked. And it was a literal case of adding insult to injury as both Schrantz and Gilchrist were out minutes into the game. That left only little Bert Sutter and new man Eddie Wood to man the barricades. Midway through the first half, the Tigers got close enough to try unsuccessfully for a field goal. Undaunted, they roared down the field a few minutes later with a 73-yard drive that culminated in a touchdown by Roseth, one of the Wisconsin backs. The goal was missed, but Massillon led 5-0 at half. Canton made some adjustments. When play resumed, they got rolling and drove 47 yards to a touchdown, aided in part by a timely forward pass to Wood. A successful point after put the Bulldogs in front 6-5. Back came the Tigers with a drive of their own, but they lost a fumble near the Canton goal line. Normal strategy called for Canton to punt out of trouble. Reynolds went back to kick, but one of the Bulldog ends was knocked into the path of his kick. The result was a safety. Massillon was back in front 7-6. That seemed to take the spirit out of the Bulldogs. The remainder of the game was played on Massillon terms. Roseth scored again, and Davidson's goal made the final score 13-6. The Tigers survived their strongest challenge and reigned as state champions for the 4th straight year. That night, the team and their fans paraded by torchlight through the streets of Massillon. In a show of sportsmanship, Blondy Wallace joined the celebration, congratulating everyone. He would have been better served by staying home and grieving. In his book, Pioneer in Pro Football, Jack Cusack, who would one day take the Bulldogs to their greatest success, described the evening's very different scene over in Canton.
I was a high school youngster of 16 at the time, but I still have vivid recollections of what occurred in Canton after its team returned from the Massillon game. One of my neighbors, Victor Kaufman, who later became a physician at Canton, had lost a heavy bet on the disputed contest. Victor was quite an athlete in his own right, covering every field from football to baseball to bike riding and track, and on that evening he took me with him to the Cortland Hotel bar where most of the Bulldogs had congregated to post-mortem the game. Arriving at the hotel, we went directly to the bar where Kaufman lost no time in making his feelings known loud enough for all to hear. "If you want to know what I think," he said, "I'll tell you. I think that game was crooked." The fight that started in the bar room was as spontaneous as the lighting of a fuse on a powder keg. Somebody swung out at Victor, and men who had been arguing the matter only a few minutes before began punching each other all over the place. Tables were overturned, and the surging crowd crashed through the plate glass window and continued the battle on Court Street until the copper arrived with their nightsticks to quell the rioters and haul some of them away to the pokey. Victor and I managed to slip out of the crowd and get away, but my friend went home in high satisfaction because he'd gotten some good punches in what he considered the right places.
The fight at the Cortland was only the biggest of the arguments and occasional fisticuffs that took place in Canton after the game that night. It's axiomatic that the bigger the game, the bigger and louder the accusations of foul play, particularly from those who have lost wagers. Perhaps it's easier to believe in conspiracy than to acknowledge that one's own pre-game assessment was foolish. I may have been wronged, but I couldn't have been wrong. Such sour grapes seldom find their way into print, although this could have been the biggest game ever played in Ohio up to that time. All the fixed gripes would have no doubt stayed in the bars and street corners had it not been for a shocking development. In his Massillon newspaper on the Monday after his team's greatest victory, Ed Stewart charged that an attempt had indeed been made to bribe some of the Tiger players. Moreover, said Stewart, Blondy Wallace had been involved. To this day, nearly every book on pro football history says that Canton threw the second game on the orders of Wallace. Most histories indicate an unnamed Bulldog end as the main pawn in Wallace's scheme. Revelations of the fix, it's agreed, destroyed pro football in Ohio for many years thereafter.
The single source of these allegations seems to be a little book published in the early 1930s called Pro Football, Its Ups and Downs. The author of this book, the first attempt at a history of pro football, was one Dr. Harry A. March, who'd served in several executive capacities for the New York Giants from 1925, and who later organized the short-lived American Football League of 1936. Dr. March practiced in Canton in 1906 and even tended to the Bulldogs as one of the team doctors. Certainly goes the reasoning the good doctor knew whereof he spoke. The passage in the book reads as follows. After the second game, the Massillon Independent openly accused Wallace of trying to frame the games with the Massillon players, and failing in this, had persuaded one Canton player to deliberately cross up his fellows and throw the game. When accused by his teammates, the player said he had simply obeyed orders as he was accustomed to do. At any rate, he left town hurriedly on the first train in his playing togs, his belongings following later, maybe. Wallace sued the Massillon player for libel, but they had the evidence and the case was soon withdrawn, his own attorneys admitting the hopelessness of their contention. Dr. March seems to have relied on his memory in describing events of a quarter century earlier, and his memory was less than faultless. As an example, he remembered the incident of the Victor football as occurring in the 1905 Canton-Massillon game, even though its use was crucial to the outcome of the 06 affair. The player who left town hurriedly was obviously Eddie Wood. March gives the impression that he was running for his life from angry fans and teammates, but it had been announced before the game that Eddie would be scampering for the first train back to Latrobe as soon as the game ended. Moreover, when he returned the following Thursday with the Latrobe team, he wasn't attacked. As a matter of fact, he actually played well on offense, contributing to the Bulldogs' only touchdown with a timely pass reception. On defense, he was less than successful because he followed orders and crashed in, allowing the fast Tigerbacks to escape outside. In view of Massillon's known up-the-middle strength, the orders seemed sound. But had there been a more sinister side to Wallace's strategies? The day after Stewart made his charge, a committee of fans descended on the morning news. Some were suspicious, some were angry, some were only perplexed. They worked up questions to ask Wallace, and he fielded them easily, explaining for the upteenth time about the Victor, he called it a phony, ball, and that Eddie Wood had been at end because Gilchrist was hurt. Sweet hadn't quit the field in disgust, as has been rumored, but only left exhausted when the game was irretrievably lost. Blondy continued to use Hayden at quarterback throughout the game instead of substituting Twister Steinberg, who waited on the bench, because Hayden was a quarterback and Steinberg was a halfback who'd filled in for easy games. He could have added that he had no faith in Steinberg's play calling. Most of the committee left satisfied, and when the morning news printed Blondy's answers, several fans came to him and apologized for things they'd said in anger after the game. Unfortunately, there was no satisfying such diehards as Dr. March, or Cusack's friend, Victor Kaufman. For them, there was no bad strategy, only bad men. Perhaps that's why Dr. March misremembered the charge laid in the Massillon paper. Ed Stewart hadn't said the second game was fixed, or the first game either. His accusation was that an attempt had been made prior to bribe some Tiger players before the first game. According to the Tiger manager, Tiny Maxwell and Bob Schring had been solicited to throw the first game by Walter East, the baseball player turned end. Maxwell and Schring had dutifully reported the offer. East claimed to be backed by $50,000 in gambler's money. Whiteman was able to nip the scheme in the bud. As soon as East's duplicity was revealed and before the first game was played, Stewart released the wayward end. Both games, as far as Massillon was concerned, had been played on the square. The most damaging and sensational part of Stewart's accusation was that East had a partner, Blondy Wallace. The exact wording contained a curious typo when thief was accidentally substituted for they. It read, East was the man who attempted to engineer the deal with Coach Blondy Wallace of the Canton team as an accomplice and thief were backed by a crowd of gamblers who agreed to furnish $50,000 to be used for betting. The cloud was not what Dr. March and all the subsequent histories said it was, but it was still a cloud, and a very dark one at that. Blondy Wallace was right under it. In some ways, Blondy was his own worst enemy. He never made any secret of his taste for the fast lane. Few Cantonians were more familiar or more welcome in local taverns. He numbered among his friends, with many shady reputations, and when the boys on the team wanted some female companionship, Coach Wallace was known as the man to see. His enemies said he did more pimping than coaching. Nor did his career after leaving Canton contribute to a retrospective image of a straight arrow. Dr. March said he became king of the bootleggers in Atlantic City, and for a while was under federal indictment. Unlike many of Dr. March's statements, no evidence has come to light to cast doubt on the bootlegger story. Blondy's friends thought of him as a free spirit, and his enemies considered him less than spiritual. Had he been more of an All-American boy instead of just an All-American tackle, fewer Cantonians would have been willing, even eager, to believe the worst of him. But the question of the day wasn't whether he drank too often or stayed out too late or dallied too openly with ladies of the night. The question was whether this football coach would conspire with Walter East and the gamblers to bribe members of the Massillon Tigers. Ed Stewart said he had. In Massillon, Stewart was believed, of course. But even in Canton, where admiration for Stewart's word was surely a minority opinion, there were many who insisted they knew it all the time. On Sunday, the day after the game and before Stewart's charges hit the street, Wallace told a Canton Morning News reporter that he didn't favor a third meeting between the teams. This was a point in Blondy's favor since the whole plot, according to Stewart, revolved around splitting the first two games to force a third. Wallace haters simply assumed Blondy had learned the cat was about to be let out of the bag and was covering his tracks. Once Stewart made his accusation, Canton polarized. On the whole, the wisest heads adopted a wait-and-see attitude. Around the country, however, many newspapers picked up all or part of the charges. There was no way Canton could avoid a black eye, no matter where the final trail led. On Wednesday, the day before Canton's scheduled Thanksgiving Day meeting with Latrobe, manager George Williams of the Bulldogs couldn't be reached for comment. Word had it he was waiting until he could pick up Canton's posted guarantee and share of gate receipts from the second game, a reported $5,500, now residing in a Massillon bank. The Morning News took Stewart to task for waiting until both Canton and Massillon games had been played to make his charges. They suggested he'd timed it so as to hurt attendance at the Latrobe game. They also noted that Massillon had admitted the word thief in the original accusatory story had been a typo. This, the Morning News felt, was a sign that the Massillon people were faltering. George Williams apparently got the money on Wednesday night because he released a long statement to the newspapers on Thanksgiving morning. After tracing the origins of the '06 team and the negotiations for games with Massillon, he got to the important news.
About 7:30 p.m. November 15th, Mr. Stewart called me by telephone and asked me to meet him as soon as possible as he had a matter of importance to discuss. As we were having trouble about a head linesman for the game the next day, I supposed he wished to discuss that. I suggested we meet at 9 o'clock in my office. He arrived on time and asked me if I knew why Walter East had been discharged. I didn't. Then he informed me that East had tried to make a deal with some of the Massillon players to lose the first game and win the second, and that Blondy Wallace was implicated. I asked him to walk over to the Cortland Hotel and repeat what he had told me to Mr. John Rommel. At first he declined, but finally accompanied me to the Cortland and met Rommel in the parlor. He repeated the story, and when I asked him how we could remedy it, he replied the whole deal had been nipped in the bud by them, and their signals and formations had been changed, so there was no possible chance of East or Wallace being in possession of the new signals and formations.
Rommel did ask the obvious. Wouldn't it just be best to publish the whole story? Get it all out in the open? Stewart was against it. He said that it would hurt attendance.
Besides, their coach, Mr. Whiteman, would be placed in a position that East could gloat over. If Canton should win the first game and Massillon the second, but if it were reversed, or either team won both games, it would be all right.
Just why this should embarrass Whiteman more than Stewart or the Massillon players wasn't explained. Williams asked Stewart if the games were on the square as far as Massillon was concerned. Stewart assured him they were and left.
Our team returned at 9:50 that night, and Rommel and I immediately got Wallace and went to his room. We placed Stewart's story up to him. He gave us every assurance that East had not given him any information and that he was in no way connected with any deal and that the boys were going out there to win. I have every reason to believe that Wallace told the truth as to matters pertaining to the game. I believe it was played on the square.
Before the second game, Williams again became nervous over reports that such out-of-town money was being bet on Massillon. Again, he braced Wallace.
He informed me the team was in fine shape physically, which was shown on the field the next day. With this assurance and the fact that players asked for advance money, which they received and turned over to a prominent businessman of Canton to be wagered on the Bulldogs, I gave my money to a party to bet for me. That the players had bet advance money with a prominent Canton businessman is at variance with another of Dr. March's assertions. He accused Wallace of holding the players' salaries with the promise of betting it on them for the first game. When Canton won, Dr. March stated that Wallace told the players he'd been unable to get any bets down and that he would put it on the second game. Instead, Wallace pocketed the cash, said March. George Williams was the team's business manager. Dr. March treated the players for shin splints and muscle pulls. Williams, in his statement, regretted that the Bulldogs had lost, but he believed everyone had done their best. It amounted to a vote of confidence for the players and Wallace. Stewart and H.A. Croxton, the prominent Massillon manufacturer known to foot many of the Tigers' bills, had another statement. They regretted exceedingly that it had been necessary to air such a nasty mess. They completely exonerated Williams, Rommel, and all other Canton backers of any complicity in a bribery attempt. Blondy Wallace was pointedly omitted from their statement altogether. The one person who wasn't heard from, and the one person who seemingly would have the most light to shed on the story, was Walter East. But his side would have to wait. He was out of town, supposedly traveling. Fears that the scandal would hurt attendance in the Latrobe game led Canton newspapers practically to plead with the fans to show up. Those who did saw the Bulldogs put on a fine show, winning 16-0. Steinberg was brilliant all day, and Reynolds featured with a 90-yard touchdown run on a fake kick. Eddie Wood started at end for Latrobe, but left early when an official detected him slugging little Bart Suter. A crowd of 6,000 had been hoped for, but only a loyal 939 actually came to the park. The Bulldogs couldn't even cover expenses out of that, much less pay their players. Williams and Wallace blamed the scandal for the small crowd, but that was probably not the whole reason. Once the team lost to Massillon, most casual fans just lost interest. If Stewart had said nothing at all, the attendance still would have fallen well below expectations. It was small consolation in Canton to learn that Massillon also had a disappointing day. The Tigers had gone to Chicago to beat the All-Western team, a crew of stars led by the great Willie Heston. Late in the game, Heston's pro career ended forever when his leg was broken in a fierce scrimmage. From the Massillon point of view, the worst was the meager attendance of only 2,000. Obviously, Chicago was unimpressed with the Tigers' claim as Ohio champions. The Canton Morning News confidently reported that the Tigers had cost their backers $20,000 for the season, and that such a loss would undoubtedly be the death of football in Massillon. Regardless of the size of the loss, the Massillon players had been paid. That was more than can be said for the Bulldogs. Wallace announced a $25,000 libel suit against Stewart, Croxton, and the newspaper publishing company. He claimed that by reason of the libelous publication, he had been injured in his business and profession and that his good name and professional credit had been ruined. Blondy was broke. So were his players. They hadn't been paid since the advance money they bet on the Massillon game. At long distance, the Pittsburgh Post described their condition as frenzied. That was a bit strong, but they were stranded and penniless in Canton, relying on a few charitable friends for room and board. Some reports had the Bulldogs owing them as much as $6,000. Wallace promised to get them their money, but they knew his situation. They could have easily gotten a judgment against him, but that would have gained them only a meaningless piece of paper. Yet they saw no hope in sitting around Canton waiting for Blondy to win his libel suit. On Saturday, some of the Tiger players came over to join a benefit game to raise money for the stranded Bulldogs. This third Canton-Massillon game drew about 500 fans, but if they expected to see a real game, they were disappointed. It was nothing more than a burlesque, with some Canton players on the Massillon side and vice versa. Few players with their normal positions, and everyone was careful not to get hurt. A practice would have been more exciting. The final, if anyone cares, was 5-5. Enough was derived from the charade for each stranded player to purchase a railroad ticket home, with a glad remembrance that after he returns there was a lucky man who didn't have to walk. Lucky or not, the players wrote a nice thank you note to the football public of Canton. It appeared in the morning news and was signed by Jack Ernst, Paul Steinberg, and Tom Thorpe, representing the team. It put a sportsmanlike finish to what had been a truly terrible week in Canton. Walter East returned to Akron near the end of the following week.
What he had to say made headlines all over Ohio.
Upon my return from the East, I find a considerable unpleasant notoriety has been attached to my name in connection with the Canton and Massillon football teams, and consequently, in justice to myself and for the enlightenment of the public, I herewith present a statement of the case without reserve. I shall not go into the numerous details which finally terminated in an agreement with S.H. Whiteman, coach of the Massillon team.
Incredibly, East accused Sherb Whiteman of being behind the whole thing. According to East, Whiteman had first asked East to solicit Maxwell and Schring, then had East find a backer who would pay Whiteman $4,000, and finally, at the last minute, backed out of the deal. Of crucial interest to Cantonians was the following.
I notice further that Whiteman and the management of the Massillon football team charge Mr. Wallace, manager of the Canton football team, with being a party to the deal. If he was, it was wholly without any knowledge on my part. No member of the Canton football team or Canton Athletic Association were, so far as I know, connected with the deal in any manner whatsoever.
East went on to deny that he had ever been connected with other fixes in other places, as had been alleged in the original charge by Stewart. Furthermore, East insisted that the only reason Stewart went public at all was to ruin attendance for the Latrobe game. As proof that Whiteman was at the root of the fix attempt, East furnished the Akron Beacon-Journal a copy of a contract in which Whiteman agreed to have the November 16th game thrown for $4,000. It was signed by East, John T. Windsor, one of the owners of the Akron baseball team, and Sherburne Whiteman. Fast on the heels of East's confession came another. John T. Windsor admitted to his part in the scheme, backing East in all particulars. He said he didn't know Wallace at the time of the attempt and still didn't. To all except the most die-hard Wallace haters, Blondy had been completely cleared. Whiteman was now on the hot seat. He had an explanation. After reading East's charges, he gave an interview to the Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Anything and everything I did in conjuncture with East and Windsor was done in accordance with instruction from Manager Stewart and the backers of the Massillon team. When East first came to me with his scheme, I reported his proposition to my employers, and they told me to go ahead with it and see what lengths East would go. Consequently, I strung them along until I had the signatures of East and Windsor down on paper. When that was done, East was released, and it was seen that we had gold-bricked them. Consequently, the great plunging of the first game on part of the bettors didn't take place. East's statement doesn't worry me in the least, for I'm innocent of any attempt to pull off any dishonesty.
Ed Stewart rushed to defend his coach, agreeing that Whiteman had entered into the contract with East and Windsor at the behest of the Tiger backers in order to get the goods on the fixers. That explains Stewart's statement to George Williams on November 15th, that Whiteman would be embarrassed should the bribery attempt be made public, and the Tigers lose the first game. He knew Whiteman's name was on a paper that said the game would be thrown. What it didn't explain was why Wallace's name had ever been dragged into it at all, or why Stewart had chose to air the story at a time that it would do most harm to Canton. George Williams and the other Canton backers knew why. They charged Stewart had deliberately set out to injure Canton football by destroying confidence in the team and ruining attendance at the Latrobe game. One Canton official is quoted as saying,
So long as Jake Wise had charge of Massillon's interest in sport, every statement made by him was always made good. And when he stepped down and out in Massillon sporting circles, the people of that city lost the services of one of the cleanest and truest sportsmen that ever headed any organization. In the future, the management of the Canton Athletic Club will be confined to baseball and basketball contests only, but no games with Massillon with the present crowd at the head of affairs.
So in other words, as long as Stewart was there, Canton wouldn't be. Not even in basketball or baseball. In retrospect, it seems they might have underestimated Stewart. He may have had a bigger haul in mind. Remember, had the Canton-Latrobe game been canceled, the Tigers stood to gain all of the gate receipts from the second Canton-Massillon game. There was always a possibility that the Canton players would believe Blondy wasn't on the square and quit the team before the game. Even more possible, the Latrobe team, which was backed by the YMCA, might decline to involve itself with such sordid businesses and cancel. That neither of these possibilities occurred wasn't Ed Stewart's fault. As a matter of fact, the Latrobe team did indeed receive some criticism at home when they chose to go to Canton, but they were more roundly criticized when they came home without the money they were promised. The fix scandal wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back. There were already more than enough. Had there been no scandal at all, pro football of the quality played by the Bulldogs and Tigers would have surely ended after 1906. It became far too expensive to place teams of true all-stars in the field week after week. The $20,000 price tag the Canton Morning News put on the Massillon Tigers may not have been much of an exaggeration. The Bulldogs probably cost more. Another problem, although a related one, was that football, as played by star teams like the Bulldogs and Tigers, was boring. No other teams could compare with them, and fans soon grew tired of one-sided games. Fans showed up in large numbers only when the behemoths played each other. There weren't enough big games to pay the big salaries. The fix scandal hurt the Bulldogs in particular, but they were already dead in general. An era was over. On the other hand, pro football itself didn't close up shop in Ohio as many have written. It simply went on without colossi like the Bulldogs and Tigers. Most cities continued to field town teams made up of the best local athletes. Occasionally they'd import a ringer for big games, but in duos and trios, not in wholesale lots. In other words, most teams went right on doing what they'd been doing for years. As far as most of Ohio was concerned, the Bulldogs and Tigers sank without a ripple. Even Massillon put a team of locals onto the field in 1907. For one big game, they brought back Bob Schring and Peggy Parrott, but for the most part they stuck with Mully Miller, Frank Bast, and others they'd started with back in 1903. The All-Massillons did well under the excellent coaching of Sherb Whiteman. Neither Whiteman nor Stewart had lost face in Massillon, and up in Akron, Walter East was generally thought of as having been the hapless victim of a crooked coach and Machiavellian manager. No one got very upset when East was retained as manager of the baseball team. He lasted, as most managers, until the team began losing. Apparently, the only one who lost anything more than money was Blondy Wallace, the proverbial innocent bystander. His libel suit never came to trial. The reason was probably that he settled out of court rather than that Massillon had some sort of secret evidence, as Dr. March alleged. With Whiteman and Stewart under the gun, they would have hardly held back any facts that could have made them look better. At the same time, Wallace was too deeply in debt to turn down any reasonable cash offer. Perhaps he should have gone to court. Because he didn't, there's no real end to the fixed scandal. It just whimpers out in charge and countercharge. But because Dr. March and his followers have had the last word for 3/4 of a century, the name of Blondy Wallace has lived on in infamy.
I gotta go to Ohio, seems so rose to hoe. I gotta go to Ohio. When I was 3,
the majority of the story you just heard appeared in Volume 5 of the PFRA newsletter in 1984 and was written by Bob Braunwart and Bob Carroll. For more background on the Blondy Wallace scandal, along with a list of the music you heard today, head to nationalfootballpost.com, click on the football history banners. There you'll also find some great interviews by Ken Cripen with some of football's best names in his Where Are They Now series. My thanks again to the Pro Football Researchers Association. Please visit them at profootballresearchers.org, where you can find printed versions of stories just like the one you heard today. If you like what you heard today, please tweet it, like it, share it, get it out there. Leave us a review on iTunes. If you'd like to contribute to the show, contact us at information@nationalfootballpost.com. We'll be back soon with more stories from football's past. From National Football Post and the Pro Football Researchers Association, I'm your host, Eric Oler. Thank you for listening to Throwbacks.
I grew up and moved away. Can't believe I didn't stay. I returned one happy